Now here in subsection 8.4 of the business cycle chapter, we're going to talk about some theories of short-run instability. Going back to our debate we keep going back to, remember the conflict between the classical economists and the Keynesians. The classical economists believe the economy will self-regulate and gravitate toward full employment. The Keynesians and their followers do not believe that's true, that without government intervention, the economy could be stuck at an equilibrium that's below full employment. So let's take a look at the Keynesian theory in more detail. So Keynesian theory is referred to as a demand side theory. It will spend all of its time talking about the aggregate demand curve. Now we know the aggregate supply curve is also important, but that's not what Keynesians worry about. What they believe, as we can see on this slide, is that a recession originates with the deficiency of spending. So for some reason, the aggregate demand curve is too far to the left. And we could think of several reasons. One of them we mentioned was expectations of the future. Let's assume people believe that next year is going to be a really bad year. This war in the Middle East, or rather the war in Ukraine, is getting out of hand and it's going to cause some future problem. So people start contracting the amount of new cars and things they're buying because they're worried about the future. Keynes said the mere fear of the future could literally change the economy today by causing the aggregate demand curve to be too far to the left. And so therefore we would need some kind of government intervention to increase the spending back up to the amount of aggregate demand to the right that we need it to be. And so we'll look at a slide in just a second to illustrate this. And also we could have an opposite problem. If the aggregate demand curve is too far to the right, in other words, if people are exuberant about the future and are overconfident about the future, and are spending too much money, like we see during a housing boom when prices keep rising because everyone's out trying to buy a new house, then we could have too much demand in the system, and therefore the government should step in and raise taxes as one mechanism to suck some money out of the economy so people won't be spending quite so much on houses and thereby bring housing prices back down. So both of those situations, either the economy is underperforming and the government tries to stimulate it, or the economy is overperforming and the government tries to slow it down to a more sustainable level. Now, another demand side theory, which is not straight out Keynesian, but it's related to it, is also referred to as monetary theory. Now, monetary theory is also a demand side theory, and it emphasizes the role of money creation, the printing of money in financing aggregate demand. So instead of looking at people's expectations to spontaneously change their spending, monetary theorists focus on what is the Federal Reserve System doing. We have, in the future, we have entire chapters on how the Federal Reserve functions, but the Federal Reserve is the government agency that makes a decision about how much money will the government print or not print. In slang, we refer to tight money, meaning the government is underproducing the amount of money supply. So when you have tight money, what ends up happening is interest rates are very high, people cut back on spending on houses and cars, and it causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. Easy money is a slang term that refers to a time period when the government is printing lots of excess money supply, causing a surplus of money in the banking system, driving interest rates down, causing people to now increase the amount of things they buy that are on credit, causing a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. So whatever people individually want to do, it turns out the Federal Reserve can also either shift the aggregate demand curve to the left or to the right, depending on what they do with money printing. So it turns out that these are parallel theories. The Keynesian theory focuses more on specifically what individuals are choosing to do on their own, whereas the monetary theory is talking about essentially the same thing the Keynesians are doing, shifting the aggregate demand curve, but now because some government agency has either printed excess money or hasn't printed enough money and made the money supply either tight or easy when they've printed a lot of money. Now that we've described it in words, let's take a look at it on a graph or a picture. On the left-hand slide, we have inadequate demand being represented. Remember, the solid line is the assumed original position. So let's assume we started off with the solid green demand curve and of course the aggregate supply curve, and as you can see, they intersect at E1, and E1 lines up vertically with Q1. You notice Q1 is below the full employment level. So we're assuming the economy is in equilibrium below full employment, which means we're in a recession, right? So now we're thinking about what could we do to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right? Because remember, in previous slides, we mentioned that Keynesians believe the government should be actively doing this. What could the government do? Well, the government could reduce taxes. The government could start a spending plan for bulking up the military or build more highways. Whatever, anything that the government does that increases total spending in the economy shifts the aggregate demand curve from the solid green line to the dashed green line. And you notice now where's the equilibrium? If the aggregate demand curve sub zero is the dashed one, you notice it's now intersecting the aggregate supply curve at E sub zero, which if you vertically go down now to your x-axis, you see we're now at full employment. So according to the Keynesians, the government can take an underperforming economy and the government deliberately shifts the aggregate supply, the demand curve to the right, increasing demand in the system, thereby giving business people a reason to increase production to the full employment level. Now, in the second slide, let's assume that there's an excess demand in the system. People are going crazy buying houses, prices are rising too rapidly, the economy is clearly overheating. Kind of like a long distance runner who's running at too fast a pace. If you're a marathoner, you don't want to run at a sprint because you'll give out too soon, right? You want to have a steady pace that can be accomplished for the long run. So let's assume that we are now at, again, the solid aggregate demand curve 2 line, intersecting the aggregate supply curve at E2, and you notice that lines up vertically with Q2. You notice Q2 is above the full employment level of output, which means we're producing more than we can sustain for the long run. So the government says we should slow things down a little bit. How do we get the demand curve from the solid green line to shift left to be where the dotted green line is? Well, the dotted green line, you notice where it intersects aggregate supply, lines up perfectly with the full employment level. So the theory here would be the government needs to reduce demand in the system. How could it do that? It could raise taxes, for instance. That would suck money out of the system, and therefore people have less money to spend on houses, and therefore it would cool down the boom in housing because the housing prices are rising too quickly. So that would be an example of the government trying to slow the economy. So when the economy is in recession, the government wants to increase the demand to speed up the economy. When the economy is overheating and we're at the peak of a business cycle and we're growing too fast, the government would want to try to slow the economy. If they do it correctly, speeding up when the economy is too slow, slowing things down when the economy is too fast, then we would have the economy growing at a nice even 3% per year, which would be good for the overall economy because it could be sustained in the long run. And last but not least, we now have to look at a supply side theory. Remember, supply side theories are not Keynesian theories. Keynesians worry about aggregate demand. Supply side theories are theories of what could cause the economy to be underperforming because there's something wrong with this ability to produce goods and services. You notice in the graph we have here, the solid green line and the solid blue line, so the green line is aggregate demand, the blue line is aggregate supply, is in equilibrium at E3, which corresponds with vertically down to the real output axis, we see that we're producing at Q3. And Q3 is below full employment. So we need to do something to get the economy to increase its output. In previous slide, we were discussing the Keynesian argument that the government should change the aggregate demand. In this argument, in the supply side argument, they're saying something is preventing supply from increasing. Let's shift the supply curve to the right. Now, how would you do something like that? Well, let's assume that one of the problems is the government is over-regulating businesses, and therefore businesses are not coming up with new innovations because they're too heavily regulated. One argument would be if you dismantled some of these over-regulations, the economy would now be freer to innovate and come up with new ideas. And as it does so, new inventions would come to market which are better than the previous technology, thereby reducing cost of production. If that's true, what's happening to the aggregate supply curve? It's shifting to the right. If you did this exactly right, and of course we're assuming that we actually can do all these things exactly, in real life of course it's way more difficult, but theoretically we have the idea that if we could get the government off the back of business people in a particularly good way, businesses will naturally increase their production, and then we'll be at the new aggregate supply curve, AS0, and it intersects aggregate demand curve 0 at E0, which lines up, as you see, with full employment. So we can stimulate the economy through the demand side, which is the Keynesian approach, or we can use the supply side approach by trying to increase the underlying ability of the economy to produce.